Hey everybody, John with Owl. Today, I'm going to be talking tires, the amount of calls and information requests that we get to ask about what size tires are going to fit on my Sprinter, what are the best brand of tires, what size wheels should I use, what about lugs and wheel spacers and everything. So I'm going to do my absolute best to explain everything there is to know about tires and wheels and putting them on your Sprinter van. Let's start with the basics. Let's talk about tire size. I've got a couple of tires here. These tires is actually a 37, which is way too big for a Sprinter van. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's a 37. This is a 275/70 R17. So that's a little bit different. What's the difference there? Well, one is being measured in metric and one is being measured in standard. And there's a couple of different numbers. If it's being measured in standard, and on Sprinters we typically work with metric, it's really easy. 37, that is the overall diameter of the tire. By 12.5, that means it's 12.5 inches wide, the tread, basically the tread width. By R17, so R means radial, and you really don't need to worry about this. We don't use like bias ply tires. Well, you do in off-roading sometimes, but not for Sprinter vans. So disregard the R. 17 is the wheel size. That's the diameter of this inner part of the tire. So if this were to say R16, that would be a 16-inch rim. R17 would be a 17, and so on. Personally, my recommendation for your Sprinter van is to go with a 17. You have a wide variety of wheels and tires, and also the size of the rim actually affects how you can air down and go off-road. We can talk about that a little bit more later. So this, a standard tire, a lot more simple to understand as far as the naming of the tire. Let's move on to a Sprinter tire. Now disregard the fact that it's fairly dirty. I use the van. But what we've got on here, like I said, it's a 275/70 R17. So I'm going to explain this tire using this tire. So this is all in millimeters. So for all of you Americans, the British gave us the metric system and then they realized it sucked. Or excuse me, the British gave us the standard SAE system, realized it sucked, and then went back to metric, but we're stuck with standard. So millimeters, there are 2.5 centimeters in an inch, also known as 25 millimeters. So that gives you a frame of reference. So let me show you with this tire. A 275 means that the width of the tire, it's super confusing because it's all aspect ratio and none of it makes any sense, but I'll do my best. 275 millimeters is the width of the tread. Then we've got 275, 70. So this is an aspect ratio. Why they don't give you a number, I don't know. But I believe that the aspect ratio is 70 means 70%. Therefore, if this is 275 millimeters, this distance is 70% of this distance. Let's say this was 10 inches wide for the sake of argument. If this is 10 inches wide, then a 70 aspect ratio would make this 7 inches. So this would be a 10 by 7. So this is 275 millimeters here by 70% of that. I know, it's weird, but that's how they do it with the metric system. Then, after that, you have got R17. We talked about the R. 17 is the rim size. And then you also have load ratings. Obviously, with these vans, they're not light, so you're gonna wanna make sure that you have a load rating that is up there heavy enough to support the weight of the van. In our case, like this tire, what is the load rating on this tire? This is a load range D, so it has a max load of 1,600 kilograms or 3,525 pounds. Obviously you want to go, not your entire vehicle is going to have its weight on one tire, so you're splitting it up by 4. So if this is a 10,000 pound van, you have roughly, not exact, but roughly 2,500 pounds per tire. So definitely want to make sure that you're well, give yourself a large margin of error when it comes to load rating, especially if you fill it up with, water and gear, and also running low tire pressure. We can talk about that in a minute. What's the biggest size that'll fit on my Sprinter? This is the age-old question. It's actually true of almost every off-roading you do. I love Land Cruisers, and one of the running jokes in the Land Cruiser forum is the first question everybody that's new to it asks, what's the biggest tire I can run on my, FJ80, etc. Well, We get the same question in Sprinter vans. Why? Well, bigger tires allow for better ground clearance. It raises the vehicle up, so it's going to allow you to go off-road more safely. It gets the whole undercarriage of the vehicle up. That's why we use big tires. They also tend to roll over small bumps and rocks better. If you've got a small little divot in the ground, a larger tire is going to go over it, where a smaller tire would fall into it. So it's not just about ground clearance. A larger tire is going to allow you to go more smoothly over uneven terrain. What else with a larger tire? Well, a larger tire changes the gearing of the vehicle. We can talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But what is the largest tire we can run on a Sprinter van? Well, it's all relative. I'm going to talk about VS30, which if you don't know is a 2019 and beyond Mercedes chassis. So that would be a 2020 Revel, which is what this is, and beyond. All storytellers are VS30s. VS30s have a smaller wheel opening, a smaller wheel arch than the NCV3, which is the previous van. In fact, our neighbors here have one. That's an NCV3. So you can see, in fact, if we walk over here real quick, look how much gap there is here. Okay, so that allows you to fit a much bigger tire on that wheel opening than you can on ours. In fact, look here again, look at behind the tire. See how much gap there is between that and the mud flap? Well, look how much gap there is here. Almost none. Sorry, my shadow. Okay, so when you talk about the largest tire that's going to fit on a Sprinter, there are a couple things to keep in mind. The first thing is, will it fit? What will it hit? So a 275 70/17 is the largest that will fit on a four-wheel drive and still function properly with the adaptive cruise control, collision avoidance, etc. If you go any bigger, what happens is you have a wheel speed mismatch. So the rotations of the wheel are going to be slower than the vehicle says that the van is going based on GPS. So the wheel speed sensor and the GPS mismatch. The ECU assumes there's a critical error or critical failure and will turn off collision avoidance and cruise control, adaptive cruise, etc. So that's why we're kind of limited with this tire size. If you don't have adaptive cruise or collision avoidance, then it shouldn't make a difference. I haven't driven a van without those, but it shouldn't make a difference. You can go larger. As far as going larger, the amount of trimming and modifications you have to do are based on the size of the tire. So you can fit 35s with fairly large cutouts. So let me take you off of this and show you some stuff. This has to be either trimmed or replaced with a Mondo mud guard relocation kit. You can also get, this is actually the Van Compass because this is before, I did this before the Mondo. So this part comes off. So this upper plastic part, and I have a video as to how to install this. This upper plastic part pops off. This is actually a sheet metal part that we cut and then used a mud flap relocation kit that moves this further away from the wheel. You have to do that. I'll double check as to what size tire you have to start doing that modification, but we have in our FAQs at the bottom, we do have some info about the different size tires you can run. I'll put a link in the description. Then for 33s or 32 and change, which is what a 275 equates to, you don't have to do a ton of cutting, but you see how much of this fender well has been trimmed out all around here. And in front, I didn't do much trimming, but if you were to go up to say a 35, you'd have to cut out a lot of this as well and even trim this. In fact, I think I can walk around. I think I did that on the other side in preparation for 35s, which will eventually do. So here you can see how much more has been removed. You can see clear into the bottom of the bumper, and you see that this has actually been trimmed here and here to give more clearance. Now, I don't need that for this size tire, but you will if you go to a 35. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. So that's how much you have to trim. Now you don't need to, for 275 70s, you don't actually need to relocate this. And in fact, with a Mondo, you don't have the option to relocate the rear. But if you're going with anything larger than a 275, then Van Compass's relocation kit does include a rear bracket that you'll be able to relocate that. So that's the largest tire that you're able to fit on a Sprinter. So now let's talk a little bit about tread. One of the things that you'll notice are there a bunch of different tires in the way they look. If you are running predominantly on asphalt or pavement, you're going to have a much different tread pattern than you would for something like a mud and snow, which is what this is, mud terrain, or in this case an all-terrain here. So right away you can see by looking at these different tires, look at the size of what are called the lugs or the blocks on a tire. You can see they're largely spaced out. And this is so that you can clear dirt, debris, mud as you're off-road. The tighter those treads get, the more the tire is likely to pack up with mud and dirt and also just not give you as much traction. These sharp blocks on the tire actually provide, they dig into the dirt or in rocks and they actually grab and they really help you off-road. Whereas if you were going with a higher mileage tire that was purely made for street, like we've got over here on this NCV3, which I'll show you again, you can see how much smaller the treads are. This is probably the factory tire that came on the vehicle. Very small treads, very square, and notice there's almost no tread on the side of the tire. What's different here? Well, you can see there's a lot of tread on the side of this tire, and that's a little bit different from the tire we just looked at. Why is that? Well, in its form off the vehicle right now, this tire has kind of a natural shape, but obviously the weight of the vehicle is going to squish this tire down, and as you lower the air pressure off-road, what happens is the tire squishes down, and let me take it off this platform and maybe I can show you a little better. The tire squishes down. See that? If I stand on this, you can see how it kind of squishes down. So what that does is it expands. See how that tread that was on the side of the vehicle is actually now rolling. Hopefully you can see that. Can you guys see that? Yes. You can see the tread on the side of the tire is actually rolling down, and you end up with a much wider contact patch. So again, we talked about this tire being 12.5 inches wide. Well, if you air it down to, let's say, I don't know, 15 to 20 PSI off-road, the tire's gonna smash down, squat a little bit, and you're gonna roll the sidewall onto the ground. And it's gonna do two things. One, it's gonna give you a wider contact patch. It's gonna give you a lot more traction. The other thing is if you are in an obstacle or off-roading, you can also use these to grab, it's gonna roll up the side and it's gonna grab rocks and these kinds of things and allow you a little bit better chance of going over the obstacle or getting through the obstacle, if you will. As far as the best tires, we get asked that all the time. There is no best tires. It's like, what's the best color? Everyone's got their different opinion. These are, Patagonias are popular these days. Some people say they wear out quickly, who knows? Some people either love the BF Goodrich, KO2s. KO3s are a little more aggressive for a van, but the KO2s are kind of the go-to. It's what everybody uses on these vans for the most part. You can't go wrong with it, but it doesn't mean it's the only tire that works. You also want to rotate your tires from time to time. I think most people recommend about 2,000 miles. You can choose to do whatever interval you want to, but we won't talk much about tire rotation in this one. I find tire rotation an incredibly boring subject. Wheels. First thing you'll notice about wheels is they all look incredibly different and they're very subjective. So the first thing you want to do is understand what wheel you like the aesthetics of. That's kind of number one as far as one of the main purposes of the wheel. Let's not kid ourselves. Aesthetics matter for this stuff. You want your van to look cool. Let's put aesthetics aside. I have two wheels here. This is a Black Rhino Arsenal. This is what I have on my vehicle. This is actually from an FJ60 Land Cruiser. And I'm going to show you the difference between these two because this is only part of a wheel. It also has this. This is what's called a bead lock. This is a non-bead lock wheel, although Black Rhino claims that it has bead locking-ish technology. What is a bead lock? Why would you use it? Well, until recently, you didn't really have an option for a bead lock on a Sprinter unless you went with a custom wheel. This is going to, well, let me explain this. The bead of a tire, let me roll my trusty tire back. The bead of a tire is this right here, all right? And what happens is that bead of a tire seals the air into the wheel. So when you have a wheel like this, if we put this here, what happens is that bead sits here and you see this little notch here, that bead pops over. It's called setting the bead. So if you air your tires down off-road, it is possible that you pop a bead. Now, it doesn't mean the tires popped like a flat tire on the street. Popping a bead simply means that the tire carcass comes over this and outside the tire. It will no longer hold air. That's why bead locks were invented. So this on the street, you really don't need a bead lock. It's when you get off-road that a bead lock can matter. So this has got kind of a faux-ish bead lock, and you'll notice that when people are inflating tires, the beads are very tight, and the tire will be loose, 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 and then they'll inflate it up to sometimes 150 PSI. You'll hear a large bang, and the tire will pop over the bead, and then they'll lower the tire pressure back down to what you're actually going to use on the vehicle every day. So that's a bead. So why would you have a bead lock? Well, again, if we talked about how lowering the tire pressure allows the tire to expand and give you more traction off-road, it also raises the opportunity for that bead lock to pop off of the wheel, or excuse me, that bead of the tire, not bead lock, to pop off the wheel. So what is a bead lock? Well, a bead lock is pretty cool. And let me start by saying bead locks are not legal for road use. My disclaimer, I would never ever, from the bottom of my heart, instruct you to do anything that Uncle Sam has not deemed is okay for you to do. That said, people run bead locks on the street all the time. People have faux bead locks, and the ability for the government to tell the difference between a bead lock and a faux bead lock is nearly impossible. Are bead locks unsafe on the road? My opinion, no. The government's opinion, they just said no. Why? I think they just didn't test it, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, so that's the legality of bead locks. Now, how does a bead lock work? Now, bead lock works, we saw on this wheel that the tire sat between this groove and this groove. Now, on a bead lock wheel, the bottom of the tire would sit inside that groove. That's the same. But the tire would not pop on the inside of this. It would actually sit on this lip. And so there's no way for this tire to hold air because this lip would just come off. That is where a bead lock ring comes in. And you see all these holes. This is so you get an even seal and it doesn't leak. So the way this works is you put a tire on and the tire's loose and sitting on top of there. And then you put the bead lock ring on. And the bead lock ring comes with all of these bolts that get torqued down all the way around the wheel, and that actually crushes that tire. It crushes the bead of that tire in between these two, and it makes it airtight. Now, why is this important for off-roading? Well, if this is actually physically bolted down, now the bolts are not going through the tire, let me be clear. It is essentially creating a vise that pinches that tire. It smashes it and holds it super tight. And it allows you to run incredibly low air pressure, and it makes it very unlikely that you're going to come off of the wheel as far as your bead coming off the wheel. So that's why bead locks are really popular for off-road applications, and we're just now starting to see some bead locks enter the sprinter space. I know Black Rhino has a bead lock that's just come out, and if you watch this video a long time from now, maybe bead locks will be ubiquitous, but as of now, there are only a couple on the market. This wheel comes with two different bead locks. This is an aluminum bead lock ring and a steel one. I'm not going to sit here and debate aluminum rings versus steel, but typically steel is able to be hammered back into place. So most off-roaders prefer steel parts because you can weld it, you can hammer it, you can bend it, all very doable out on the trail. Nobody's going to be able to weld aluminum out on the trail, and when aluminum fails, it tends to fail catastrophically. Steel tends to bend. When aluminum breaks, it breaks. And so if you were to hit a rock and bend or break this, the ability to pound, bend, or weld it back into place to be able to hold air is near zero. And so some people prefer a steel beadlock rim. This is, they're about equal in weight, so it's not really a weight savings thing. So that is a quick tutorial on a regular wheel with a faux beadlock and an actual beadlock wheel. So you can make whatever choice you want to make as far as the wheels there. Next, on a wheel, I want to talk about offsets. Look at the difference here. An offset, so there's a couple of ways that people talk about this stuff. There's backspacing and there's offset. In the car world, offset is what people talk about. In the off-road world, a lot of manufacturers will talk about backspacing. What's the difference here? Well, offset is measured from the center of the wheel. So you see how this hub, this is where it connects to your vehicle. Now where that hub is in relation to the center of the wheel. So if this rim is like 8 inches wide, so let's say the center is of course 4 inches, that would be an offset of 0. So the offset relates to, is this inside of center line or is it outside of center line? And what that does is, as the offset moves further in, it pushes the tire further out of the vehicle, which gives you a wider track. A wider track means that you're lowering your center of gravity, which is usually good for off-road. Why would you not want to go super wide? A couple of reasons. One, fitting down trails. If you go super wide, you can't fit down some trails. 2, with a Sprinter van, and this is very unique to Sprinter vans, you have a sliding door that opens. You can only go so wide on that rear tire before you would have the sliding door hitting the rear tire and not allowing it to open. So Sprinter vans, unlike a Jeep or a Land Cruiser, are a little bit more limited as far as the offset they can run. So that's offset. What does a spacer do? Well, a spacer will change the offset of a wheel. So ideally, you have a wheel with the right offset. Unfortunately for Sprinters, we don't have a lot of offset options. Now, Owl has a wheel coming out that has a much better offset than the options on the market, but I'll do a video on those when they come out. A wheel spacer will allow you to space the wheel further off the vehicle, and that will allow you to clear things like brake calipers, make your track wider. So this van has this wheel width are 20mm spacers, and some people get really nervous about spacers, and spacers have a bad reputation. And yes, theoretically, if you could get a wheel with the proper offset for the application you want, that's ideal. These are a much better application because they're what's called hub-centric. So a lot of spacers that are lug-centric uses the lug bolts. Absolutely incredibly dangerous. You would never run them on a vehicle this heavy. Hub-centric means that when this wheel is designed, it is not designed to carry load on the lug bolts. The lug bolts of a van are not strong enough to carry the load of the vehicle. And so the actual hub slides in this. It's called hub-centric. It allows the wheel to be perfectly centered on the hub, no vibration. And it also means that the weight of the vehicle is going to be carried on that hub, not on the lugs. And so with our spacers, we build that in so that that weight is transferred directly back onto the hub and again is not on the lugs. That's really a critically important safety issue. So that is a spacer and offset. What is backspacing? Backspacing is another term for basically the same thing. Instead of offset, the way backspacing works is they will put a ruler on the back of the wheel and then running a tape measure from that something straight down to this hub mounting surface. On this wheel, it's probably 4.5 inches. So this wheel also has a backspace, but they don't measure it in backspacing. So essentially, you're getting to the same number, which is where is that hub in relation to the wheel? So with offset, you know where it is in relation to the wheel because you know where centerline is. On this, if you've got backspacing, if you want to know where that hub is, you'd have to take the width of the rim and then subtract the backspacing off, and you can essentially get to offset. So those are two different numbers that essentially measure the same thing. If you are planning on changing your wheels, there's a couple of things you want to keep in mind. There are 2 types of lug bolts, and in fact, when we go to a spacer, we go to a stud and a lug nut. A lug bolt means that the tire that the lug is going and threading into the hub. When you put a stud in, you thread a stud into the hub permanently, and then you have a threaded part that sticks out. Ignoring that for a minute, there are 2 types of lug bolts that are common for these wheels. The factory lug bolt is called a dome style. And it's called a dome style because it's got this curved lip, and that will fit perfectly into the seat, which is this part where the lug bolt goes. And you have to have it fit properly in the seat. You never want to mix up these lug bolts. So if you have a dome style lug bolt, you need to get dome style wheels, or should I say if you have dome style wheels, you need dome style lug bolts. Factory wheel, dome. Very few aftermarket wheels are domes. Why? Don't ask me, I have no idea. Most aftermarket wheels are cone style. Instead of being rounded, it's got a chamfered cone style there, and you can notice on Black Rhinos and almost all aftermarket wheels, it's a cone style. So when ordering aftermarket wheels, even if you have the correct length factory lugs, you absolutely need to order the cone style. The only time this doesn't really matter is if you're doing a spare tire carrier. If you're simply holding a wheel onto the hub of a tire carrier and you're not cranking these things down to 80 foot-pounds, 100 foot-pounds, it's fairly irrelevant. You don't want to crank them down too much because you don't want to damage that seat, but because that wheel is not actually carrying load, it's not as important in regard to the type of lugs. The other thing that can really make your life easier is this. This is a wheel stud hanger, and what this does, if you don't have studs and you're using lug bolts, you can actually screw this in to the top of the hub over here. I don't know if you can see that. And then the wheel actually slides over it. And this stays on the vehicle, and it's going to perfectly line the wheel up for putting in the other lug bolts. And then when you're done with those, you unscrew this and you put the lug bolt in for that final lug, the 6th lug. These we saw on our website. They come with our tire carriers, but if you don't have a tire carrier, you can pick one of these up on our website fairly inexpensively, because changing wheels and tires, it makes it so much easier. So hopefully I have answered all of your questions that you may have about wheels and tires, and what to get and how to mount them and what fits and all the different aspects. It can be a little bit of a confusing part, and it's one of the first things that people do when they buy a new vehicle, because the factory wheels, let's face it, they're undersized, they're high mileage, they don't look that great. So it's one of the first changes that people make to make their vehicle perform better, look better, and people have a lot of questions about it. So to recap, max tire sizes, you can go on our website and go in the FAQ, and it'll have a list of all the different tire sizes, what fits your vehicle, what fits a specific year, whether it's a 4-wheel drive or a 2-wheel drive. Again, for the purposes of this video, we spoke about 4-wheel drives without a lift or with a lift. This has a Van Compass 6.3 lift on it. All of those specs are on there. We talked about mud terrains, all terrains, high mileage tires. You can pick what application suits your type of driving best. And then we talked about the different types of wheels. I guess the only other thing I'll talk about is the size of a wheel. Wheels on cars keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You don't want to do that with off-road tires, and that's because you want this sidewall, you want this big aspect ratio so that you can air down and make sure that you get a big contact patch. If you have a like a 20-inch rim or something, then the bigger the rim, the smaller the tire. When you air them down, you're not going to gain any traction, and so you're going to really limit your off-road capabilities. Now again, if your van stays on the road 100% of the time, don't worry about it. If you want those big old spinners, knock yourself out. Anyway, so that's my explanation of wheels and tires. Feel free to leave a comment if I forgot anything or left anything out. I've been known to get stuff wrong in the past, so I think I got all this stuff right, but if I didn't, make sure to let me know. If you want more videos and information, you can like and subscribe. You have to hit the notification button if you want to get notified when we have new videos. Outside of that, you're always welcome to call our staff. They're more than willing to answer all of your questions, even if it's a product we don't sell. I appreciate it.